Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If men say they want love, connection, and loyalty, why do so many of them choose something that offers none of that? Why would a man willingly pay for intimacy he knows is temporary, scripted, and emotionally empty? This isn't about desire. This isn't about lust. This is about fear, control, and a deep misunderstanding of what intimacy actually is. Let's talk about why men love escorts and what that choice really reveals about them. Men don't pay for bodies, they pay for control and clarity. That sentence alone makes people uncomfortable because it forces us to look beyond the surface level excuse of men are visual or men just want sex. If it were truly about bodies, attraction, or physical release, then intimacy would be free, abundant, and easily satisfied in real relationships. But it isn't, because what many men are actually chasing is an environment where nothing is emotionally demanded of them and nothing unpredictable can happen. Control becomes the currency and clarity becomes the luxury. Control means knowing exactly how the interaction will go. There will be no emotional escalation, no unexpected needs, no moment where a woman asks, "Where is this going?" or "How do you feel about me?" In that space, a man doesn't have to manage someone else's emotions or confront his own. He doesn't have to regulate discomfort, tolerate uncertainty, or risk being rejected for who he really is. Everything is defined, timed, and transactional. That predictability feels soothing to men who are internally anxious but externally composed. Clarity is the second thing being purchased, and it is often more valuable than sex itself. Clarity about expectations, roles, and outcomes. No mixed signals, no ambiguity, no emotional decoding. In real relationships, intimacy comes with layers, attraction mixed with attachment, desire mixed with responsibility, affection mixed with accountability. For men who have not developed emotional literacy, that complexity feels overwhelming. Escorts offer a simplified version of intimacy, stripped of emotional depth, where the rules are clear and the boundaries are firm. For men who feel confused or inadequate in emotional spaces, this clarity feels like relief. This dynamic is often rooted in fear, not indulgence. Fear of not being enough, fear of being seen too deeply, fear of failing emotionally where performance alone is not sufficient. Many men have been taught how to achieve, earn, provide, and perform, but not how to connect, express vulnerability, or sit with emotional discomfort. When intimacy starts requiring emotional presence instead of transactional exchange, some men experience it as a threat to their sense of competence. Paying for control allows them to stay in familiar territory where power dynamics are clear and self-worth is not questioned. There is also an illusion of power at play. When affection is bought, it feels earned without effort. Attention is guaranteed, desire is assured, and rejection is removed from the equation. This creates a temporary sense of dominance, but it is fragile and dependent on payment. The moment control is tied to money, it stops being real power and becomes a substitute for internal security. Yet for men who feel powerless in emotional spaces, this illusion can feel safer than risking authentic connection. Over time, prioritizing control and clarity over emotional reciprocity conditions men to associate intimacy with silence, simplicity, and emotional absence. Anything that requires negotiation, empathy, or vulnerability begins to feel unnecessary or exhausting. This doesn't come from arrogance or entitlement as much as it comes from emotional underdevelopment and avoidance, where intimacy is reduced to a transaction because genuine connection feels too unpredictable to navigate. Escorts offer zero emotional responsibility, and that feels safe to many men. Safety in this context has very little to do with physical comfort and everything to do with emotional exposure. Emotional responsibility means being aware of how your presence affects another person, responding to their needs, regulating your reactions, and staying engaged even when things become uncomfortable. For men who have never been taught how to do this, or who learned early on that emotional expression leads to criticism or rejection, responsibility doesn't feel natural, it feels dangerous. So, when an interaction promises connection without consequence, attention without obligation, and closeness without continuity, it registers as relief. In these transactional spaces, men are not required to show up emotionally. They don't have to listen deeply, remember details, or respond to shifts in mood. There is no expectation to comfort, reassure, or adjust behavior based on another person's emotional state. This absence of responsibility creates a controlled environment where nothing lingers after the interaction ends. No unresolved conversations, no emotional debt, no follow-up. For men who feel easily overwhelmed by emotional demands, this clean exit feels stabilizing, almost therapeutic in the short term. Many men associate emotional responsibility with loss of autonomy. In real relationships, intimacy often asks men to compromise, to be consistent, and to show care even when it doesn't benefit them immediately. That requires emotional stamina. Escorts remove that demand entirely. The interaction exists in a vacuum untouched by the realities of daily life, conflict, or emotional growth. For men who equate emotional involvement with pressure or suffocation, this vacuum feels peaceful, even though it is empty. There is also a deeper layer of emotional avoidance underneath this sense of safety. Emotional responsibility means being seen not just for what you provide, but for who you are, including your flaws, insecurities, and limitations. That kind of visibility can be terrifying to men who have built their self-worth around performance and control. When responsibility is removed, so is the risk of being judged on an emotional level. The interaction becomes about maintaining an image rather than exposing a reality. Over time, this pattern reinforces the idea that emotional labor is something to be avoided rather than developed. Men begin to associate relationships with effort and transactions with ease. They learn to confuse emotional distance with peace and detachment with strength. What feels safe is actually a space where growth is suspended and vulnerability is never practiced. The nervous system adapts to this avoidance, making authentic emotional connection feel increasingly foreign and uncomfortable. This is why emotional responsibility feels threatening to some men, not because it is inherently burdensome, but because it requires skills they were never encouraged to build. Without those skills, safety is redefined as absence. Absence of expectation, absence of accountability, absence of emotional risk. Escorts offer that absence perfectly. And for men who fear emotional complexity, absence feels far safer than intimacy. The illusion of power, attention without accountability, is one of the most seductive dynamics in transactional intimacy. Power in its healthiest form comes from self-control, emotional stability, and the ability to influence without coercion. But the power experienced in these situations is artificial. It is manufactured through money, not earned through presence or character. Attention is guaranteed, admiration is performed, and desire is scripted. This creates a feeling of dominance without requiring inner strength, which can be deeply appealing to men who feel uncertain or inadequate in emotionally reciprocal spaces. When attention is bought, it removes the possibility of rejection. Rejection is one of the most psychologically challenging experiences for many men because it confronts them with questions about their worth, desirability, and emotional competence. In real relationships, attention is fluid. It increases and decreases based on behavior, effort, and emotional attunement. Accountability is the price of sustained attention. But when accountability disappears, attention becomes effortless. This effortlessness is mistaken for power, even though it is entirely dependent on external validation and financial exchange. This illusion allows men to feel wanted without having to be responsive. They are not required to notice emotional shifts, respect boundaries beyond the transaction, or adapt to another person's needs. There is no expectation of growth or self reflection. The dynamic positions the man as central and unquestioned, reinforcing a sense of control that feels empowering on the surface. Yet this control exists only because the other person is economically incentivized to maintain it. The moment payment stops, the power evaporates, revealing how fragile and conditional it truly is. Attention without accountability also protects men from emotional consequences. In genuine intimacy, actions have impact, words matter, absence is felt. In transactional spaces, nothing carries forward. There is no emotional memory, no accumulation of trust or disappointment. This emotional erasure creates the illusion that one can experience desire without consequence, closeness without cost. For men who fear the weight of emotional responsibility, this consequence free attention feels like dominance when in reality it is detachment dressed as authority. Over time, this dynamic reshapes how power is understood. Instead of seeing power as the ability to maintain connection, tolerate vulnerability, and stay present through discomfort, it becomes associated with avoidance. Power is redefined as being untouchable, unaffected, and unchallenged. This is why real relationships begin to feel threatening to men accustomed to this illusion. Accountability feels like loss of control, even though it is the foundation of mutual respect. The tragedy of attention without accountability is that it weakens the very capacities that create genuine influence. Emotional intelligence, empathy, and relational skill are muscles that only develop through reciprocal engagement. When men opt out of accountability, they opt out of growth. The illusion of power provides momentary validation, but it erodes the ability to sustain real connection, leaving behind a hollow sense of dominance that depends entirely on external structures rather than internal stability. Fear of rejection makes transactional intimacy feel easier than real connection because rejection is not just about being turned down, it is about being evaluated. In real intimacy, a man is not only chosen or rejected for his appearance or status, but for his emotional availability, communication style, consistency, and ability to connect. That kind of evaluation feels deeply personal. It threatens identity, not just ego. For men who tie their self worth to being competent and in control, rejection feels like exposure of inadequacy rather than a neutral mismatch. Transactional intimacy removes that threat entirely by ensuring acceptance in advance. In transactional settings, rejection is structurally impossible. Desire is guaranteed, attention is assured, and interest is pre negotiated. There is no moment of uncertainty where a man has to wonder if he said the wrong thing, showed too much interest, or failed to impress. That certainty calms the nervous system. It allows men to bypass anxiety rather than confront it. Real connection, on the other hand, requires tolerating ambiguity, waiting for replies, reading emotional cues, risking vulnerability without knowing the outcome. For men who have learned to avoid emotional risk, certainty feels safer than possibility. Many men carry unprocessed experiences of rejection from earlier stages of life. Rejection from caregivers, peers, or romantic partners often teaches men to suppress emotional needs and avoid situations where those needs might be exposed. Instead of learning resilience through rejection, they learn avoidance. Transactional intimacy fits perfectly into that avoidance pattern. It offers proximity without emotional stakes, closeness without the chance of being dismissed, and interaction without the risk of not being enough. There is also a social dimension to this fear. Men are often conditioned to believe that rejection diminishes their masculinity. Being rejected is interpreted as failure, weakness, or lack of value. This creates a psychological environment where avoiding rejection becomes more important than pursuing genuine connection. Transactional intimacy reframes the interaction as a business exchange rather than an emotional one, allowing men to protect their self-image. If nothing is at stake emotionally, nothing can be lost. Over time, choosing transactional intimacy over real connection reinforces the belief that emotional risk is unnecessary and dangerous. Men become more comfortable with scripted desire and less tolerant of emotional unpredictability. Real women begin to feel intimidating, not because they are demanding, but because they introduce the possibility of rejection. Transactional intimacy feels easier because it eliminates the emotional labor of courage, the courage to be seen, to be imperfect, and to risk not being chosen. Without practicing that courage, fear quietly dictates choices, shaping intimacy around safety rather than authenticity. Modern relationships demand emotional skills many men were never taught, and this gap creates silent tension between expectation and capacity. Emotional skills are not instinctive. They are learned through modeling, reinforcement, and practice. Skills like emotional regulation, empathy, active listening, and vulnerable communication require guidance and permission to develop. Yet many men grew up in environments where emotional expression was discouraged, minimized, or punished. They were taught to solve problems, not to sit with feelings, and to suppress discomfort rather than articulate it. As a result, when modern relationships ask for emotional fluency, many men feel unprepared without fully understanding why. Today's relationships are no longer structured solely around survival, provision, or clearly defined gender roles. Emotional connection has become central. Partners are expected to be emotionally present, self-aware, and responsive. They are expected to communicate needs clearly, repair conflict constructively, and engage in emotional growth together. For men who are trained to equate strength with silence and independence with emotional distance, these expectations feel foreign. They are not resisting intimacy. They are navigating a language they were never taught to speak. This disconnect often shows up as withdrawal rather than refusal. When emotional conversations arise, some men shut down, become defensive, or disengage entirely. This is frequently misinterpreted as lack of care, when in reality it is emotional overload. Without the tools to process feelings in real time, the nervous system reacts with avoidance. Modern relationships require men to tolerate emotional discomfort without escaping it. Yet many men learned early that discomfort should be endured privately or eliminated quickly, not explored openly. The emotional skill gap also affects conflict resolution. Healthy conflict requires staying present, validating another person's emotional experience, and regulating one's own reactions. Many men were never taught how to do this without feeling attacked or diminished. Instead of seeing emotional feedback as information, it is experienced as criticism. This makes relational repair feel exhausting and unsafe. Over time, men may gravitate toward environments where emotional skills are unnecessary, mistaking simplicity for peace. What complicates this further is that emotional skill development requires vulnerability, and vulnerability contradicts many traditional definitions of masculinity. Being open about fear, uncertainty, or emotional need can feel like a loss of status or control. Without alternative models of strength, men are left choosing between outdated emotional armor and modern relational demands. This internal conflict creates frustration, distance, and confusion on both sides of the relationship. When men are not taught emotional skills, they often internalize the belief that they are failing rather than undertrained. This belief fuels avoidance rather than growth. Modern relationships are not asking men to become someone else. They are asking them to expand their capacity for connection. But expansion requires instruction, patience, and permission, all of which were absent for many men long before they entered their first intimate relationship. Why this choice often deepens loneliness instead of solving it becomes clear when loneliness is understood not as the absence of people, but as the absence of emotional resonance. Loneliness is not cured by proximity, touch, or attention alone. It is relieved through being known, understood, and emotionally held over time. Transactional intimacy provides interaction without continuity, presence without memory, and closeness without recognition. These encounters may temporarily distract from loneliness, but they do not address its root because nothing meaningful accumulates from one interaction to the next. When intimacy is reduced to a transaction, the nervous system learns to expect connection without emotional investment. This creates a pattern where emotional safety is defined as distance rather than depth. Over time, real connection begins to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Loneliness then intensifies because the individual is surrounded by experiences that simulate closeness without ever fulfilling it. The gap between what is felt in the moment and what is missing afterward grows wider, making the emptiness more noticeable once the interaction ends. Another reason loneliness deepens is because transactional intimacy reinforces emotional isolation. There is no shared history, no mutual vulnerability, and no opportunity for emotional repair. Each encounter starts and ends in isolation, reinforcing the idea that connection is fleeting and impersonal. Without the experience of being emotionally remembered, individuals may begin to feel interchangeable and unseen. This erodes the sense of belonging that alleviates loneliness, replacing it with a repetitive cycle of temporary relief followed by deeper emotional absence. Loneliness also deepens because this choice avoids the very processes that build emotional resilience. Genuine connection requires risk, patience, and the willingness to tolerate discomfort. These experiences teach people how to self soothe, communicate needs, and recover from rejection. When these processes are bypassed, emotional muscles remain underdeveloped. The individual becomes less capable of forming and sustaining meaningful bonds, which increases isolation over time rather than reducing it. There is also a psychological contradiction at play. While transactional intimacy removes the fear of rejection, it also removes the possibility of being chosen freely. Being paid attention to is not the same as being wanted. On an unconscious level, this distinction matters deeply. The human psyche seeks validation that is voluntary and reciprocal. When attention is guaranteed by money, it lacks the emotional weight needed to counter loneliness. Instead of affirming worth, it subtly reinforces the belief that connection must be bought rather than earned through presence and authenticity. Over time, repeated experiences of emotionally empty intimacy can numb the desire for real connection. Expectations are lowered, emotional needs are minimized, and loneliness becomes normalized. What began as a coping mechanism slowly becomes a condition where emotional distance feels safer than longing and isolation feels more manageable than vulnerability. In this way, the choice that promised relief from loneliness quietly trains the individual to live with it more deeply ingrained. At its core, this entire pattern is not about desire, pleasure, or indulgence. It is about avoidance, avoidance of emotional risk, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of growth. What looks like choice is often fear in disguise, and what feels like control is frequently a response to feeling unprepared for real intimacy. When men choose transactional closeness over emotional connection, they are not choosing ease. They are choosing familiarity over depth, certainty over meaning, and safety over fulfillment. The cost of that choice is not immediate, which is why it feels harmless, but over time it quietly reshapes how intimacy is understood and experienced. Real connection is not effortless, but it is transformative. It requires emotional skills, courage, and the willingness to be seen without guarantees. Without those elements, intimacy becomes shallow, power becomes performative, and loneliness becomes chronic. The solution is not shame, judgment, or denial, it is awareness. Awareness that control is not the same as security, that clarity without connection is empty, and that emotional responsibility is not a burden but a pathway to genuine belonging. Until intimacy is approached as a space for growth rather than escape, the very strategies used to avoid pain will continue to create it.